Hey all, Rob Miracle here from Yo Photo Dude. I've been asked multiple times about how I go about editing my wildlife photos or photos in general, and I thought this might be a good opportunity to sit down and kind of explain the process and go into detail about what all the different sliders are in the various editing tools. For this video, I'm going to use Adobe Photoshop, and I'll be using its companion product, Adobe Bridge. I shoot my photos in RAW, so when I open a file, it's going to open in a tool called Adobe Camera Raw. For many of you, you use Lightroom, and the controls in here are almost identical to what you have in the Develop module in Lightroom. If you're editing on your iPhone, the photo editor in there also has many of the same controls. So you should be able to apply this to just about any editor. The names of the sliders and controls might be different, but the process is basically the same. So let's get started. Okay, we're going to start in Adobe Bridge. I've navigated to a recent trip to the Jordan Lake Dam to photograph eagles, and I have one of my eagle photos selected here. I'll double click on it, and it will open in a tool here called Adobe Camera Raw. Now, immediately looking at this, the first thing I look at is the histogram here, and it is fairly underexposed. Most of these tones should be toward the middle for an average photo. If it's got more of a darker background or things like that, it's okay for it to be to the left toward the blacks. This side over here is the white point. And we have the option to come in here and control things about the lightness of the image, the color of the image, and other tools. And we will touch a few of these as we go along. So first thing we're going to do is address the lightness. So I think this exposure is actually pretty good, but I'm going to bring it up just a little bit, because somehow once I share this to Facebook or other social media, it ends up being a little bit darker. It's also very flat when it comes to contrast, so there's not a lot of contrast in this image. So I'll start usually by bumping this up to say 25, and I may come back to it later. Next, I notice the tail here, these whites are pretty white, and so it may be blown out a little bit. So I'll pull the highlights back a little bit. Say take it to 25. So exposure is brightness, contrast is, do you have grayish tones or do you have more black and white? Because if I take contrast all the way up, you can see it brings a lot of pop to it, but sometimes that can be unrealistic. If I take it all the way to the other side, it fades out. So we'll start at 25. Highlights affects the bright parts of the area. So here I've taken it all the way down, and I do have more detail in the tail. So we may end up bringing this down a lot more. If I bring it up to 100%, you can see it's now blown out in the tail. But we'll start at 25 and we make negative 25 and we may come back to it. One way of also addressing this is you can use the white point to help bring this over, but the more you do that, the more it just overall lightens the scene, but it also blows the whites out. And also, if you notice this over on the histogram, this little triangle here lit up, and you now see this little spike. That means I've blown out the whites. So you definitely don't want that to happen. So I'm going to bring this back to where the whites aren't blown out, which is actually a little bit darker than it should be. You can also use the black slider to affect the darkest parts of the image. So I can take it almost all the way down, or I can bring it all the way up. And both of these are another way to impact contrast. So I'm going to continue bringing that black point down. Let's say minus 40. All right, so it'd be nice to see this eagle up a little bit closer. So what I'm going to do next is jump over to the crop tool. I've also got some foam on the river down here. This heron's cute, but it really is not contributing to the detail that you want to see in this photo. So I'll use the crop tool over here on the side, and I can bring this in Now, by default, this crop tool is going to maintain the aspect ratio that the video was shot in. In this case, it was shot in a 4:6 or 2:3. And when I bring this into filling the frame reasonably, I still have kind of excessive space on the side. So I can come over here and say I want to go to a 4:5, which is the same as an 8:10 photo. 4:5s are also the preferred format for most social media sites. Instagram loves 4:5s and squares. 4:5s work really well on Facebook and Twitter. Threads, they don't really care, but it's a good place to start. So now that I've kind of cropped in, I can click over here on Fit to fill out the frame. And now we get a better idea of what our photo is going to look like. So I'm going to click back up here on the sliders, and we'll come back here and now look. Well, yeah, those feathers are still kind of blown out. So let's bring the highlights down, say -50. It's an OCD of mine to try to hit 5 values, but you really should be able to pick 51 or 52 if that's what makes sense. You need to be visually selecting it and not paying attention to what the actual numbers are. The shadow slider impacts the darker areas that aren't toward the blacks. So if I bring the shadows down, it darkened up the feathers quite a bit and the background a little bit. If I bring the shadows all the way up, you get a lot more detail in here. In this particular case, I'm probably going to raise the shadows up a little bit, but not a lot. The next thing to address is color. So color's measured in 4 sliders. You have the temperature slider, the vibrance slider, saturation slider, and the tint slider. You also have the ability to pick the shooting conditions that you were in. So in this particular case, I was kind of in the shade, so I could pick shade and it will warm the photo up. Now, sun was rising. It's actually not a bad representation, but it's too yellow for my liking. I could try cloudy. That's a little bit better. Or daylight, which is pretty good. But I'm going to bring it up because I want a little bit of warmth to it, to about 6,000 Kelvin. All right. The tint is pretty good. Let's see, it was currently at +10. If you take it toward the magenta, it adds magenta. You take it toward the green, it adds green. So sometimes letting the camera figure that out for you is not a bad place to start. Vibrance brings up the amount of color, kind of like the smooth areas. Saturation is just total overall color and things like that. They're very subtle. I usually like adding a little bit of saturation and not too much, but a little bit more vibrance. So say maybe +8 or +10. The next thing I'm going to do is come into effects. And the ones I'm going to talk about here are texture, clarity, dehaze, vignette, and I'm not going to deal with grain too much. There's other ways to add grain to the photo other than doing this. Texture affects the contrast of larger areas. So as I raise it up to 100, you can see overall the picture's gotten more contrasty. If I flatten it out, it's almost getting hazy. So let's start by adding, say, 10, 11. Clarity, on the other hand, is the contrast around small areas. So if you watch the feathers on his chest, when I take it up to 100, you can see that the contrast there changed quite a bit. If I take it all the way down, it gets kind of fuzzy. So I tend to give a little bit more clarity to images. Dehaze is good if like you got some fog or something you're dealing with, or it's just a hazy day. If you take it all the way up, it really pops a lot of contrast in. It also has a tendency to turn the image rather blue. If you take it the other way, it just does really nasty things. So I usually don't do this unless I do have some serious haze. Now, vignette is a fun one. If you give it positive, it'll add white to the outside corners. If you take it to the negative side, it gives you black on the outside. But adding a little bit in, and this is part of what I learned in photojournalism school. They always wanted us to burn the edges in on the photos. And by doing this, it helps draw the attention to your subject. Since my eagle's in the middle of the frame, if I darken the corners a little bit, your eyes are naturally going to be pulled to the subject. All right, but don't overdo it because it gets kind of grody when you overdo it. Just a little subtle darkening and it'll work wonders. All right, some of this other stuff is getting into something way more complex than this video needs to be, but I do want to come down to the detail slider. Now, I shot this at ISO 4000. I've raised the exposure up, I've messed with the shadows, so I've created some unnecessary noise in here that I need to get rid of. Adobe recently added this denoise button, and you can kind of see the raw noise. And here in a second, it will give you what it will be done when it's finished. So I'm going to click that enhancement and let it do its thing. It'll take about 20 seconds. We'll come back when it's done. Okay, it's done. So let's go back and look at the image. So it's been cleaned up from noise quite a bit. But I'm sitting here and looking, some of the stuff we've done has blown out some of the highlights. So I'm going to come back up to the light channel and try to bring the highlights down some more to where I'm not clipped. And now we're almost completely brought down. So it's what, about -76 to fix this one up. So now we've got a pretty good image. So we're going to go ahead and open this in Photoshop. Okay. So we have it now in Photoshop, and that's pretty good, but I think it can be sharpened up some more, potentially even having some more noise taken out of it. So I'm going to use a tool from a company called Topaz Labs called Topaz Photo AI. And you access it under the filter section and pick it from the menu. Now, Topaz Labs is an add-on product, and it does cost about $160, but it is really good at what it does. So it has gone through, and it has figured out that it needs to sharpen the subject. It doesn't think it needs to remove noise, but I'm going to go ahead and turn that on anyway and see if it can smooth this out. So it smoothed that background out quite a bit. And under sharpening, I can come in here and look at different options like strong sharpening. If I think the lens was blurry, I was a little bit out of focus, I can choose that. Now looking at his head, I don't really like what it did to the feathers there. Motion blur, if I think it's coming from motion. But I'm going to go back to standard, because that seemed to do a pretty good job. So the eye's nice and sharp. The water droplets down here are pretty sharp. And you've got decent detail in the feathers from this. So we'll save it. And that's pretty much it. At this point, I've got some actions in Photoshop that I will use to put my watermark on this and then size it for social media and save out those JPEG files for use. Hopefully you found this video helpful. I'll include the links for Topaz Labs in the description. And happy hunting and happy post-processing.